Hello and welcome to the France 24 interview. My guest today is William Burns. He served under 5 U.S. presidents, 10 secretaries of state. He was ambassador to Russia, to Jordan. He rose through the ranks of the State Department, eventually becoming Deputy Secretary of State under Barack Obama between 2011 and his retirement in 2014. He's now the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, where he joins us from. Thank you very much for being with us, Ambassador Burns.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be with you.
You are the author of a recently published book called The Backchannel, a memoir of American diplomacy and the case for its renewal. It's published by Random House. Mr. Burns, I want to get straight to the news. War with Iran, is it a real possibility for you?
Well, I worry very much today about the dangers of escalation and the potential for a military collision, even if I don't believe that that's President Trump's intention right now, nor is it the intention of the Iranian leadership. But the Middle East is oftentimes the land of unintended consequences, and we're in a situation now where it's far too easy to see hardliners on both sides in Washington and Tehran becoming kind of mutual enablers, going up a very unsteady escalatory ladder. So I do worry about the dangers of collisions.
You were one of the architects of the Iran nuclear deal. You met secretly with Iranian officials in Oman and other places. The U.S. decided to pull out of the agreement a year ago. It now seems that Iran is progressively getting out of the agreement, and the other signatories of the agreement, especially the Europeans, seem to want to defend it in talk but not in action. Do you think it's on its last legs?
I think there's a real danger right now that the agreement will collapse. I think it was deeply unfortunate and a profound mistake for President Trump to abandon the nuclear agreement, which was achieving its purpose of preventing Iran from developing a nuclear weapon and did represent the will and the efforts of the international community. I think the United States strategy suffers today from incoherence. President Trump says that what he's interested in is a better nuclear deal. But the actions, the means that the United States is choosing today seemed aimed at different goals, either the capitulation of this Iranian regime or its implosion. I don't think either of those goals are realistic. And when maximum pressure becomes, in effect, an end in itself, I think you run real risks of escalation.
Right. Donald Trump, as he had with other countries he has conflicts with, has said, I want to talk to the Iranian leadership. Do you think there's any possibility of such negotiations or maybe already back-channel talks between both camps, or do you think we're far from this?
Well, there's always that possibility, but, the Trump administration says that it's pursuing an approach based on coercive diplomacy. But so far, it's been all about coercion and not at all about diplomacy. In other words, a willingness to engage in the pursuit of realistic goals. It's still possible that you could create the circumstances in which you could begin to talk to one another. But it's not just a question of saying that you're ready to talk. It's also a question of what you're prepared to talk about. And I think the administration would have to signal that, it has realistic goals designed to strengthen the nuclear agreement and perhaps deal with some of the other issues that so sharply divide Iran and the United States today. But I think there's no substitute for that kind of direct diplomatic engagement. But I think under current circumstances, it's hard for me to conceive that, either the Trump administration or the Iranian government are going to be prepared to engage under the current circumstances of heightening tensions.
Right. I want to get to another bone of contention between the U.S. and another country, a much more powerful country, at least economically and possibly militarily, the U.S. and China. You write in your memoir that as you end your diplomatic career, it was clearer than ever that nothing mattered more in American foreign policy than managing this relationship. It now seems we're at a crucial point in that relationship.
I think that's right. I think strategic competition between the United States and China is a reality. It's likely to be the central task for American statecraft for decades to come. History is full, as you well know, Mark, of collisions between rising powers like China and established powers like the United States. I don't think that collisions are inevitable, but managing that competition is going to be incredibly complex. I think President Trump is right, in my view, to push back against predatory Chinese trade and investment practices, but I think he's wrong in the unilateralist tactics that he's employed so far and the generally unilateralist strategy that he's employed. In other words, there are lots of other countries, the European Union, Japan among them, who share our concerns about Chinese trade and investment practices. Logically, you'd want to make common cause with them rather than starting second and third front trade conflicts with them over steel and aluminum and other issues. And more broadly, I think in terms of strategy, the goal ought to be not so much to try to block China's rise, which I think is a foolish aim, but rather to shape the environment into which China rises. That requires us to work with allies and partners to try to build institutions and agreements like the Trans-Pacific Partnership, big new global trade agreement that the last administration negotiated. Those are the ways in which you shape the incentives and disincentives of the Chinese leadership over time.
Right, but it seems that everything the Obama administration has done is being undone by the Trump administration. Obviously, Donald Trump just announcing that he would run for re-election. There is concern in Europe and in other places that essentially Donald Trump is a wrecking ball in terms of multilateral institutions. I mean, do you think a second term could really harm the multilateral agreements of the past half century?
I do think there's a big difference between 4 years of an essentially unilateralist American strategy in the world and 8 years. I think the corrosive damage that you can do, not just to America's standing in the world, but to the hopes for a reshaped international order to fit the realities of the 21st century, become more and more remote the longer this unilateralist impulse and the narcissism of President Trump, guides American strategy in the world. So I think there's a lot at stake right now. The United States needs to adapt to a world in which we're no longer the singular dominant player that we were during what many people call the unipolar moment after the end of the Cold War. But it's still a landscape on which we have a very strong hand to play, not just because of our military and economic leverage, but because of our capacity to draw on alliances and coalitions of countries. That's really what sets us apart from lonelier powers like China and Russia. But I fear today that we're squandering that asset. And so, as I said, there's a lot at stake as we look ahead, not just at our election, but the next few years in American foreign policy.
Right. I want to get to the issue of Russia. You were ambassador there. You recount vividly how you first met Vladimir Putin in 2005 and how he already warned you that Americans need to listen more. There was also an encounter back in 2007, which you recounted in a cable to the Secretary of State at the time, and in which Vladimir Putin essentially accuses the U.S. of conspiring with NGOs to undermine his re-election. And obviously, given all the controversy around the 2016 U.S. election, one can only think that Vladimir Putin did not forget what happened, in his mind at least, 10 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, Putin, in my experience, is kind of an apostle of payback. He's a combustible combination of grievance and ambition and insecurity. And he and many of the people around him and the current Russian political elite tend to draw a straight line from the chaos, the disorder, the dysfunction of Boris Yeltsin's Russia in the 90s when I first served in our embassy there. Their conviction that the United States tried to take advantage of Russia's moment of historical weakness, not a conviction that I share, but one which they strongly hold, running through the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine in 2003 and 2004, all the way to the present. And so when Putin saw an opportunity to take advantage of polarization and dysfunction in the American political system in 2016, he was all too eager and all too prepared to try and do that.
Right. Do you think Donald Trump has a problem in the way he deals with Russia because of all the allegations against him? Or do you think because of the way Congress, the intelligence community sees it, he is in a way a prisoner of the more general view of the U.S. towards Russia?
Well, I mean, I think the reality is, as we look at over the next few years in dealing with Vladimir Putin's Russia, we're going to be operating, the United States at least, is going to be operating within a fairly narrow band of possibilities, from the sharply competitive to the nastily adversarial. Within that band, however, it is really important to try to preserve some guardrails in the relationship. We're watching, for example, the gradual erosion of what's left of the old arms control architecture that dates back to the late Soviet period with the collapse of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty and, you know, the real question mark about whether or not the New START agreement, which regulates strategic nuclear weapons between the United States and Russia, is going to continue after its scheduled expiry at the beginning of 2021. So as difficult as the relationship is today, it is very important to focus on those essential guardrails in the relationship. I think President Trump himself has kind of a, what I view at least to be a quite naive attachment to autocrats. I think a sense that, born of his own narcissism, that he and Vladimir Putin can transform the relationship. I think Putin views Trump's efforts, you saw vividly at the press conference they did after their summit in Helsinki a summer ago. Putin views Trump's efforts to ingratiate himself as signs of weakness and manipulability as well. So I don't think it's a good prescription for managing a very complicated and largely adversarial relationship today.
William Burns, thank you very much for your time, and thank you for watching this edition of The Interview here on France 24.